Good morning, and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. Today we're going to be talking about a new bill that could help shape the future of criminal legal reform in California. And that bill is called Senate Bill 271, which focuses on who can run for the office of sheriff. But before we get into the details of this bill, I want to talk a little bit about what's a sheriff? What does the sheriff do? And why should you care? So sheriffs are actually some of the most important people in the criminal legal system. They have control over how jails operate. They determine how people are policed. They often decide who gets arrested and for what. They can also decide whether or not to cooperate with ICE on immigration enforcement. They oversee the civil evictions process, and in many places, they even serve as the local coroner. And so the wide-ranging powers of sheriff play a huge role when it comes to determining how or sometimes whether to implement reforms. And California sheriffs have been way behind the curve on this. And when looking at who they are, it's pretty easy to see why. Most of them have lengthy careers in law enforcement, and many have been in office for decades because they're rarely challenged once they become an incumbent, and they often run unopposed. California sheriffs also are more than 90% white men and are 90% white and nearly all men, even though people of color make up more than 60% of the state's overall population. And so the lack of diversity, by the way, among sheriffs in California is not a mistake. It's not a coincidence. In 1979, the voters of San Francisco elected prisoner rights advocate Michael Hennessy as their sheriff. And Hennessy was an advocate for reform, and people did not like that. So his election spurred law enforcement to then push for new restrictions on who gets to become sheriff. And they said this legislation that they put forth then said that people who were going to become sheriff would have to have certification from the Commission on Peace Officers Standards and Training, or have recent salaried law enforcement experience. In other words, they would have to be law enforcement professionals. And that law went into effect in 1989, but Hennessy was so popular that he stayed in office for the next 23 years, becoming the longest tenured sheriff in California history. And so in those years since, the limitations have stifled diversity among sheriffs in terms of demographics and experience. But SB 271 would change that. The legislation would lift those restrictions and make it so that civilians could run for sheriff again in California. And supporters of this bill, including its sponsor, who is joining us today, State Senator Scott Wiener, say that lifting these sorts of restrictions would make it so that accountability would be brought into sheriff's offices, and it would make campaigns more competitive and inclusive of different perspectives. So let's talk a little bit about how that would change the way things look now, for example. So the Sacramento sheriff race. When Sheriff Scott Jones announced that he would not be running for sheriff for a fourth term in 2022, one of the department's captains, Jim Barnes, immediately jumped into the race. And it's widely expected that another former Sacramento sheriff's captain and another Jim, State Assembly member Jim Cooper, will also announce his candidacy. So in this showdown between the Jims, the Jim who was a 22-year veteran of the department and Cooper, a 30-year-old veteran of the department, might feature a lot of law enforcement experience, but it's not going to feature a robust debate over how to make the criminal legal system better. It's going to be a debate that's very centered on punitive responses to the criminal legal system. But if the fields were opened up under SB 271, Sacramento could get a deeper pool of sheriffs who are committed to reforming criminal justice practices and who would campaign on that sort of reform. And so to talk more about California sheriffs and the potential impact of SB 271, I'm joined now today by Senator Wiener, by Kate Chatfield, Senior Legal Analyst here at The Appeal, Mark Merin, a civil rights attorney who has successfully sued the Sacramento Sheriff Department for civil rights violations. So thank you all so much for being here. We're really happy to have you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Senator, I want to start with you. So can you talk about the background of this issue in California? Tell me about the history of this law that barred civilians from running for sheriff in 1989 and why you decided that it needs to be repealed.
Sure. Thanks for covering this and for having me. And you did a great job summarizing a lot of the history. Basically, from the founding of California in 1850 until 1989, so for 139 years, anyone could run for sheriff. Anyone who was a registered voter could file and run for sheriff. You know, when we talk about sheriffs, these are some of the most powerful elected positions in California. In some counties, the sheriff is the most powerful elected official. And so it made sense that anyone could run. And then, as you described at the beginning, in 1979, San Francisco elected Mike Hennessy, and it completely freaked out the law enforcement profession that someone who was an outsider, who was not a law enforcement officer, had won a sheriff's election. And they saw, from their perspective, trouble ahead, that there were, which I think would have been a good thing, to elect more diversity of sheriffs. And so they decided to engage, frankly, in monopolistic behavior and corner the market and pass a law or get a law passed to ban anyone running from sheriff unless you are a law enforcement officer. And so that went into effect in 1989. As you mentioned, Sheriff Hennessy was in office 32 years, incredibly popular because he did a terrific job. And what we want to do with Senate Bill 271 is simply to take the law back to the way it was 139 years, to say that anyone can run, so that we actually have competitive sheriff elections, so that we have people from different backgrounds who can run for this important position, and we end this monopoly where only a microscopic percentage of the population is even eligible to run. So that's the history, and that's what we're trying to do. It's nothing radical. We're just saying, let's go back to the way it was for 139 years.
So I have to ask, you said that law enforcement reacted sort of in a very reactive way. What did Hennessy do that got them so angry and made them need to sort of push for these limitations?
Well, what he did fundamentally is win an election, right? The fact that he had sort of invaded the club, this closed club that they had of law enforcement officers, completely freaked them out, and they were worried that this would happen in other counties. But what Mike Hennessy did for 32 years is take a very progressive approach to the sheriff's department in San Francisco. He implemented like nationally groundbreaking rehabilitation, education, job training programs in San Francisco County jails. In San Francisco, may have been the first county in the country to actually place a charter high school into the county jails. It's like the only charter school that's not controversial because the public schools aren't going to set up a school in the jail. And so it's a charter school. And so, for example, a few years ago, I was robbed, and the person who committed the robbery spent some time in county jail and came out with her GED. And so he really took seriously the idea that when people are incarcerated, and we want to, of course, be aggressive about alternatives to incarceration, but when people are incarcerated, let's do everything in our power to help them exit jail in a place where they're going to be able to succeed in society. He took that so seriously. He hired amazing people to start these programs, and he did a really, really good job. So I don't think anyone could really criticize his performance, and that's why the voters overwhelmingly sent him back every 4 years until he retired. And instead, this was more philosophically, they do not want people infringing on what they view, what law enforcement views as their domain.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about your personal experience, and thank you for sharing that with all our viewers, by the way, because I think we rarely hear sort of the side of folks who have been harmed by crime talking about the need to have something other than a punitive approach. But what you're describing is sort of this need to have a less punitive approach because that actually makes our society safer. Um, and I think that plays a big role in sort of what sheriffs can do. And so to talk about that, I want to turn to you, Kate, in terms of, can you expand a little bit about why sheriffs are such important figures in California when it comes to debates around public safety and just criminal legal reform generally as well?
Sure. Well, sheriffs have, as you said at the outset, an incredible amount of power within the county. There are no term limits on sheriffs in California, so they serve for, oftentimes decades. They are very, very powerful. They have very powerful political action committees. So they are one of these law enforcement association that has a presence in Sacramento at the Capitol, and they contribute money against criminal justice reform. So in the last years, they've opposed the death penalty in California. They've opposed any death penalty reform in California. They have opposed marijuana legalization, and they've even opposed prohibitions on firearms in legislation in California. So they're a very reactionary organization as an entity, the California State Sheriff's Association. And then moreover, in the Capitol, their individual sheriff's offices. I'm thinking from, Riverside County that has its own presence in the Capitol in addition to the Sheriff's Association. So they've really been an opponent of criminal justice reform for, at least the last 50 years or so in California. And again, these problems are not unique to one county, and I know we'll talk about that perhaps later on. But there are huge problems in Los Angeles with that sheriff. There's big problems in Alameda County, in Sacramento that I know we'll talk about. In Fresno, in Kern County. So these are very large counties and some small counties where there are the institutional players that are getting elected are coming out of a very dysfunctional institution. So that's why the Senate bill would at least allow for the possibility of some fresh air coming into some of these organizations.
So it sounds like it's not just a problem of individual offices, but also just sort of the platform that a lot of these sheriffs have to be able to oppose really important pieces of legislation. But also,
absolutely, yeah. Sorry.
And so also just sort of, you mentioned Sacramento and a few other places where there are individual problems within those offices. So I'm sort of going to pose this question both to you and to Mark. And I guess we'll start off with Mark if to talk about specifically Sacramento Sheriff's Department, both under its current and previous leadership. Can you talk a little bit about the problems that you've encountered there?
Certainly, I'm pleased to. First of all, I have to salute you, Senator Wiener, for bringing this bill forward. I can't say I'm too optimistic, knowing nothing about the lay of the land in the legislature. I'm not too optimistic that you're going to succeed in getting it passed because of the power of the adversary in this case, which is the Sheriff's Association. They were powerful enough to get the educational requirements imposed to start with. So I don't know that it'll be that easy to get removed, but we'll see. Yes, the problems with the Sheriff's Department are at least fourfold in Sacramento, and I think that it applies elsewhere as well. First of all, they are the chief law enforcement officer for the county, and most of the arrests that take place in the county are outside of the city, so they really are responsible for setting the tone for how the sheriff's deputies will engage the population. And frankly, what we've seen is a command presence that leads almost directly to excessive force. Their concept is that they're the boss. When they come on the scene, everybody has to obey the sheriff, the deputy who's either investigating or intervening or arresting the persons. And even when there are allegations of excessive force or false arrest, very rarely, almost never, are the deputies who are responsible disciplined, terminated, corrected, or reassigned. So what we're seeing is the tolerance of unconstitutional excessive force cases, which are from minor, just imposing bruises, wrenched arms, to major fatalities. I think in the city, in the county of Sacramento, there's almost never been a deputy who was responsible for a police killing actually disciplined or terminated. Instead, generally, they're found to be having acted appropriately. So that's the first concern I have. The second concern, of course, is the jail itself. The jail in Sacramento is probably, I think it's up there with maybe the third highest incidence of deaths in the jail in the state. And that's been the case under not only Scott Jones's fiefdom, his period of domination, but also his predecessors. So I think that nothing good has happened that we can see and point to in the sheriff's department in Sacramento. In fact, he faces off with the Board of Supervisors and wins, because he says, I'm a separately elected official and what I say goes. And he's so conservative that I think he's still supporting our deposed president, or I wish he had been deposed, but our former president. So so that's the second area, is the actual jail operation. And I think there's just been a consent decree that the Disability Rights Foundation got against Sacramento, because it's an unhealthy place. Persons who are mentally ill aren't treated properly. Persons who aren't mentally ill end up mentally ill just by going through the experience of being in the jail. So that's the second major area that I have concerns about. The excessive force in the booking, it starts right there, where because they have cameras, we get to see it. And the numbers of people who have gotten their arms broken, their legs broken, other injuries is just outrageous. We ourselves in a small office have probably sued 50 times for people who are injured during the booking process. And that should not happen. But that's clearly a result of the culture that the sheriff imposes. And he comes from law enforcement, and he supports law enforcement. The next area is the secrecy. We know that there's been a trend to open up, to make transparent law enforcement activities, jail activities. But what we've seen in Sacramento is a resistance to the disclosure of what are really very public documents and procedures. Instead, they refuse to produce documents, even in litigation, unless they're subject to a protective order. And a protective order prevents the public from seeing documents which are admittedly relevant to cases that are brought against the jail for excessive force or other constitutional violations. So we see that. Then I think the overarching concern that I have is the idea that law enforcement is really the way to control and affect society. And we see this in the way it deals with homelessness. And I think that the sheriff in our county has used his minions, his people, to clean up under the guise of cleaning up homeless encampments, to displace homeless people without any alternative of where they can be. And I think if Senator Wiener's bill passes, then what we're going to see is a different attitude, a different approach. We're going to see people who have some kind of social service background or psychiatric or psychological background coming in and saying, we can do this job better, differently. And I think I'm just so looking forward to that possibility.
So I have to ask you a follow-up because you talk a lot about how ultimately all of these problems stem from culture. And so I have to ask the question if you think either of the gyms would be better.
Better than our present sheriff?
Yes, if they would run things differently, rather.
No, I think that it'd be in the same mold. I think when Cooper was jail commander at some time during his tenure, we had gross constitutional violations. We ourselves sued the jail in a class action for strip searching everybody who was arrested, even if you were just walking your dog on the wrong side of the road. So that was absolutely horrible. I don't know Captain Barnes personally, but if he comes out of that mold and he's been in the sheriff's department for all those years, he's going to carry on the Scott Jones tradition, and I wouldn't expect any change there.
So, Kate, we just heard about a lot of the issues with the Sacramento Sheriff's Office, but I know there are other issues happening in other sheriff's offices across California. So, for example, I know the LA County Sheriff's Department is currently under investigation for potential civil rights violations. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on there.
So, what's happening in Los Angeles is absolutely horrific. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, as a whole, there have been reports and investigations and admissions in court proceedings that there are sheriffs' deputy gangs. I'm not sure of the number, if they're 13 or 18, but literal gangs with tattoos, and their modus operandi is to target Latino youth, and they get sort of rewarded within these cliques or these gangs for shooting people on the street. There are very, very serious and credible allegations of planting evidence, of actually engaging in targeted shootings and killings. It's unconscionable. It's if I weren't reading about it in the Los Angeles Times, in CBS News, it would be hard to believe what has been happening. The sheriff there, Alex Villanueva, comes out of that organization, has done nothing except act to protect deputies. He's obfuscated, he's denied, he's refused to comply with subpoenas from the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. They had to go to court to get him to comply with the investigation that's going on now. The Attorney General Javier Becerra, in December, I believe it was in, I can't remember, it was recently, has announced a state Department of Justice investigation into the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. This is, of course, the largest county in the country. It's the largest county in California, of course. Sheriffs, deputies there, they not only have the largest jail system that they oversee, and there have been just decades of abuse in the Los Angeles County jails. The Sheriff Baca was also very intimately involved in the cover-up around those abuses. There was a federal investigation and charges around that period of abuse from Sheriff Baca and ongoing. And then, of course, as Mark said, they also have, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department has contracts with many, many cities where they are the patrolling agencies in those communities. And that's where these, deputies that are involved in gangs are allowed to run free and terrorize whole communities.
And that seems largely to be a function of sort of the lack of accountability that a lot of these sheriffs have, perhaps because they don't have to run in competitive campaigns. And so Senator, if SB 271 were to pass and civilians once again were able to run for sheriff again, do you think we'd see people lining up to run? And if that's the case, what sort of experience do you think would make make a good sheriff, who wouldn't engage in this kind of behavior, or allow this kind of behavior to happen under their watch?
Well, and this really is about accountability, and just keep in mind, it's not only about a non-law enforcement winning a sheriff election. It's also about, even if you have a law enforcement officer in that role, they will have to be accountable to the broad community, knowing that other people can run against them. Whereas right now, they're really only accountable to law enforcement, because that's where the threat to them comes from, that a law enforcement officer would step up and challenge them for re-election. So regardless of whether you have a law enforcement officer or not in that role, at least there would be that threat. And we're seeing that now with district attorneys, that we're seeing a wave around the country of district attorneys getting challenged by progressive challengers. And sometimes those challengers win, sometimes they lose. But even when they lose, it has an impact on that district attorney, because they have to be cognizant of what everyone in the community thinks, because there's such a diversity of lawyers who can challenge someone. And that's what we want to bring to the position of sheriff as well. And I think, we have to also, remember, these are real issues impacting real people, both in the jails and people who are being patrolled. But also, you mentioned at the beginning, we have sheriffs in California who are deeply cooperating with ICE, either at times we think perhaps violating state law, or at least coming really close to the line, when we've been very clear we don't want that kind of cooperation. In addition, during COVID, we have a whole bunch of sheriffs who have just brazenly refused to enforce public health orders, and not just in conservative counties. The sheriff of Sonoma County, which is a very liberal Democratic county, for quite some time was refusing to enforce COVID public health orders. And so these are like powerful, impactful decisions for people's lives, and there's very little accountability. The fact that the large majority of sheriffs don't even have anyone challenging them for re-election. And as you mentioned at the beginning, there's very little diversity in the ranks of sheriffs. So this is about accountability.
So
I'm wondering if I could interrupt just a moment. I'm curious what the future is of this bill, Senator. You think it's going to get passed? And what kind of opposition have you drawn?
So I've learned in my time in the California legislature, and you can back me up on this, sometimes even the easiest bills can sometimes stumble in the legislature, bills that have no opposition. It's a very complicated process. But we have been able in the California legislature in recent years to get some very, very hard criminal justice reform bills passed, and some hard policing reform bills passed. So really there is already active opposition to this bill. The sheriffs are already activated and making calls. But we have a very powerful coalition behind it. It's an immigration advocate-led coalition. And I think we're going to have very strong support for the bill. We're not guaranteed to get it passed, but we have a shot at getting it passed. And I also have found that with hard bills, sometimes you have to take a few different runs at it. You don't always get it passed in the first year. And even if we're going to try very hard, and we do have a shot at getting it passed this year, even if we don't, this idea is not going away. It'll keep coming back, and I think we'll get there eventually.
Mark, you should come on and be co-host, because that was my next question. No, I love it. But I'm going to ask a follow-up too. I know that there are probably some people who are looking at this bill who are thinking, well, if you want to be the boss of something, you should probably have participated in that field beforehand. If you want to be the head of the sheriff's department, you should maybe have worked in law enforcement before. So how do you respond to that criticism?
Yeah. So clearly we want qualified people to hold any office, including sheriff. But qualifications can take various forms. And fundamentally, this needs to be up to the voters. Some voters will say you need to have been a deputy sheriff or a police officer to be a qualified sheriff. Some voters, in fact, probably a significant chunk of voters, are going to think that. Other voters might think, well, you need to be attuned to reform, whether or not you're a law enforcement officer, in order to be qualified. And so different, and some people might say, you know what, we need a sheriff who is not a law enforcement officer to have accountability for this position, which so many parts of this position are administrative and policy making. And so different voters are going to have different ideas about what is the proper qualification. And that is, there's nothing, in the Bible that says you got to be a deputy sheriff to be qualified to be sheriff. And just to be crystal clear, it's always important to keep this in mind. For 139 years, back to the founding of the state of California, anyone could run for sheriff. Anyone. You didn't have to be a law enforcement officer. And, and that's for 139 years. So we did this for a long time. The only reason law got changed to be so restrictive is because the sheriffs decided they wanted a monopoly and they didn't want to risk anyone else running for office. And we also get, and similar to what you just stated, people think, well, you have to be a lawyer to run for DA, so why shouldn't you have to be a sheriff to run for sheriff? Well, again, with district attorney, there's a huge pool of attorneys. Maybe some people say too many attorneys. I'm an attorney, so I can make fun of myself. A huge pool of attorneys, which is increasingly more and more diverse, with the whole spectrum from far left to far right. And again, we're seeing DAs getting challenged, and that's healthy. The comparison to DA would be if the DAs came to the Capitol and said, we want a law saying that only people who have been prosecutors can run for DA, we would laugh them out of the Capitol if they tried to corner the market that way. Yet we have allowed the sheriffs to corner the market. It's not okay.
So we don't have much time left, but I do have two really important questions. So I'm going to try to ask them quickly. So the first one is for Kate. So we heard talk about sort of why we don't need all of these qualifications. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the current qualifications are and why those aren't necessary to have a good sheriff?
Viewers to be under the misapprehension that these peace officer standards training in California relate to the job of running a multi-million-dollar, sometimes $1 billion administration. What these are, to become a sheriff's deputy, you need a high school diploma, and then you go to get post-training, and these are modules that you go to, some classes, you get firearms trainings, you get trainings in collecting evidence, in sort of patrol, in doing searches and arresting people. So, and these are things, and then you get your post-certification that, lasts throughout your career. What sheriffs do, the breadth of their responsibilities are not collecting evidence and knowing how to shoot a gun. I mean, when we're talking, these are departments in many counties, the largest county department, and they are running multi-billion-dollar or multi-million-dollar budgets. And also in most of our counties, the jail is the single largest psychiatric institution for people with serious mental illness. As many as up to 1/3 of people in our jails have a serious mental illness. So sheriffs are not required to be experts at all in public health, in mental health. As Senator Wiener pointed out, I mean, I think the pandemic has highlighted these absences in their ability, in the county sheriff's ability to manage a situation effectively, to protect people's public health. So I think that it would be wonderful if somebody with a mental health background, an administrator with a public health background, somebody like Senator Wiener talked at length about Sheriff Hennessy, he was legal counsel for the sheriff's department before he was elected sheriff. I mean, he started so many innovative programs, including domestic violence classes for people who were incarcerated in San Francisco. And this was back in the early 80s, before domestic violence was taken it seriously. So if we had that sort of breadth of experience and expertise in our jails, and overseeing people patrolling on the streets, that would be huge. And as Senator Wiener said, it's not just that California has had this system until the late 80s, where civilians could run, but in most other states, there's not this requirement of that somebody who's attended these peace officer standards trainings needs to be the elected sheriff.
So I'm just going to ask Mark to jump in here very quickly, and we have like a minute to talk a little bit about what you're hoping to see from the next, for example, in Sacramento, from the next sheriff, or what you would like to see as opposed to the status quo.
I'd like to see a sheriff who wasn't so conservative, almost posse comitatus oriented, who thinks about the whole person and recognizes that jail could be a positive experience for some people who need maybe a little correction, but don't have to be labeled for the rest of their lives. I'd like to see somebody who's got some understanding of mental health and illness, and that would go a long way, because we have people who are killed in jail by other inmates or commit suicide, and that just should not happen. So I'm looking for someone who's more tuned in to the bigger problems in society and sees that not everything can be controlled by pressure and command, but rather listening and some correction and some hope for the future. So I'd like to see a much more positive culture develop in the Sheriff's Department.
Thank you all so much for being here. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on, and for all your hard work. So Senator Scott Wiener's bill would change the landscape in California. It would change a landscape where sheriffs today are overwhelmingly white and male, with positions that have been pretty much uniformly molded by law enforcement. And what's particularly important about this bill is that it gives an opportunity to, as we've just heard, change the culture of sheriff's departments in California. And it certainly wouldn't compel voters, by the way, to elect a reformer. It just gives them options. It would give Californians a more robust set of choices for sheriff, which in turn could actually result in debates about what public safety really means, and how the next sheriffs could properly push for a future that keeps people safe, both in jail and outside of jails. So thank you all so much for joining us today. You can continue to follow us on The Appeal Live on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Alana Sivan. See you next time.